Bryan's upstairs and downstairs. An irreverent, historical charabang trip to those stories that generally don't make it into the guidebooks of our stately homes. Wimpole's parkland and pleasure grounds stand out in the bare local landscape. As Humphrey Repton, the garden designer, said, Wimpole abounds in beautiful shapes of ground, and it is richly clothed with wood. It is therefore like a flower in the desert, beautiful in itself, but more beautiful by its situation. And just to improve the prospect, the second Earl of Hardwicke got Sanderson Miller to knock him up his own eye-catcher, a Gothic tower. It's some distance from the house, but that never deters an accomplished horseman like myself. This was the age of elegance and enlightenment, and if you wanted to show that you had an abundance of both, then no gentleman worth his salt would neglect the light-hearted touch that would finish off his estate, the construction of a folly. Talbot, take them away and ask her to give me a decent portion. Oh, and before you go, rub down Ridgeback and walk him for a while. I don't want him catching a chill. Follies were pure froth and nonsense. They were built purely for fun. Just another feature of the countryside and its attachment to the great estate. However, when you get up close, you discover that it's actually all concrete and brick. Ooh, sorry, Vicar. And it was nothing more than a theatre set, but a very fine theatre set, so that idle gentlemen like me, with more spare time on their hands than they knew what to do with, could wander out around the grounds and, in order to reward myself for an arduous cycle ride, or an arduous walk in those days, could help themselves to champagne and sandwiches and take a peek back at the house through my perspective glass to see just what all the other house guests were getting up to while I was away enjoying some solitude. Good Lord. Sadly, the Hardwickes struggled to keep the place going, and so the dust sheets came out once again. Thanks this time to the 5th Earl of Hardwicke, known to you and me as Champagne Charlie. The estate simply couldn't cope with his delicate taste in fine wines, his divine taste in fine women, and his distressing taste for putting his money on three-legged horses. The bank repossessed the house. But in 1936, the house came to life again when Captain Bambridge moved in with his wife Elsie. They bought it for, well, a sum that today would be roughly £5–6 million. A bargain, even then. But they were faced with the prospect of having to furnish the entire place. They obviously didn't have sufficient wealth to furnish this in the style to which the house had become accustomed. And when you look at all these individual pieces, they should all shriek at one another, a real sort of jangling discord. But in that clever way that some people have, they've managed to just bring all these different elements together to create a really harmonious room. It's actually quite comfy. You could see yourself living quite happily, quite at ease in a place like this.
Bambridge was army, and I think some of the bluffness of being in the army was still with him, and he liked the aspect of having uniforms and being surrounded by servants in uniform, running around with horses and carriages, footmen with staves, and so on. I think that was all jolly nice fun, and I think it was reflected in how the servants treated him. They were a bit too friendly, and for them that was not right. Nobody, I think, in today's service life would have worked for him.
The Bambridges tried hard to keep up the old traditions of masters and servants, but since the Great War, oh, it's simply impossible to get the staff, darling. A government campaign was launched to persuade demobbed soldiers and out-of-work factory workers to go into service, And it did bring many back, but they tended to go to hotels and restaurants and small private houses rather than the big country piles. It must have been a great inconvenience to the Bambridges. Of course, by this stage of the game, they were down to a mere 12 servants to cater for their every need. That probably meant, well, we know it meant much more work for the servants who were here. And in the case of Captain Bambridge, it meant the sort of work which really even the most loyal servant must have thrown up his hands in horror from time to time. In fact, we know that the captain was a little bit too dependent on the valet, if you ask me. Captain Bambridge was an officer in the Irish Guards. Now, as you'd probably expect, I don't have a great deal of experience of socialising with Guards officers, but I know enough about them to know that they seem to fall into two distinct camps. There's one who is sort of wildly eccentric, wonderfully improbable, and against all expectations, you find yourself running forward with them with nothing more than a rifle and a hand grenade to try and take out a huge German Tiger tank. And there's the other sort that are the sort of inept public school chinless wonders that you wouldn't trust to organise a panic on the Titanic. And what's remarkable about Bambridge is he seems at different times in his life to have had a foot in each camp. Clearly he was brave and heroic, but he was fairly inept. He was cold in the middle of the night and got up out of bed and couldn't figure out what he needed to do to keep warm. So rather than pick up the sweater or the cardigan that had been left on the ottoman at the bottom of the bed, he went all the way down to the valet's chambers down below, along windy little corridors and downstairs, shivering as he went, because it's cold down there even now, and then politely knocks on his valet's door and asks him could he come and help him to find something to keep warm. Now, I don't know about you, but in my book that sounds like a fairly prattish thing to do. And clearly a lot of the servants thought so too, because several of them are on record as saying that in many ways he was no better than he ought to be. In its full flowering, this house must have been a sight to behold. I mean, just look at this dining table, and you're not looking at the full money by any means. It will actually extend even further to seat 30 people in splendid, spacious elegance. But of course, as the years went by, this was not the sort of option that was open to Elsie anymore. In fact, this beautiful dining room was actually divided into three. A lot of the woodwork was removed, new doors were put in, and it was divided into the housekeeper's room, the kitchen, and the butler's room here where I'm standing, the new butler's pantry. Here because it's equidistant from the back door and the front. No under butlers or under footmen to answer the doorbell at the front or one at the back. Now it was down to just 2 or 3 servants. The glory days here were well and truly over.
Hi there.
By the 1950s, life below stairs was becoming more and more congenial. But it had to. Getting staff back into service after the First War had been bad enough. After the Second, it was well nigh impossible. Here at Wimpole, staff quarters were becoming noticeably more comfortable, as the social divide between master and servant narrowed considerably. The good old, bad old days were about to disappear forever. Rattling around alone in this huge house, Elsie spent a lot of her time thinking about her famous father, no less a person than Rudyard Kipling. In 1976, Elsie finally died, and the house passed into the hands and the care of the National Trust. But during the last years of her life, all her father's private papers, all his first editions, pamphlets, documents, manuscripts had all been kept under lock and key in this red room. It's a father's memory that sort of brings all this to a close for me, because he understood people down at the bottom of the pile. And when you consider that he was a fair way up the pile himself, that was a rare commodity, as you've probably seen watching these programmes. He'll come out with wonderful phrases to describe the life of the soldier when in peacetime nobody wants to know him. Great story, you know, it's Tommy this and it's Tommy that, and kick him out, the brute. But it's the saviour of his country when the guns begin to shoot. And if you think about it, where did all those soldiers that Kipling wrote about come from in the First and the Second War? The two wars that ultimately destroyed this whole way of life. The grand English country house with its hundreds of servants and estate workers. That foundation was very rocky at the end of the First War. And by the end of the Second War, nobody who'd seen the sort of sights they'd seen in that war was very keen to come back and spend the rest of their days in service. So in a sense, Kipling links us back to all that, to the demise of all this.